Hello, everybody. We are back with another episode of How to Leave a Cult, and I am your host, Brooke Walker. This podcast is specifically about my childhood growing up in a cult, and I also like to share some things that cults generally do across the board. So, different types of churches, and I also like to share healing modalities that have been incredibly helpful for me. It has been a minute since the last episode that I recorded. Our last episode was on practices that we had in the church that I was in. So, one of them being trances, which were channeling sessions that the leader used to do. Another one was something that they called the process, which were circles that were led by the ministers of the church, where they would sit members down and basically break down who they are, what they were doing, and do what they called process people, which was a very abusive environment. Trances could have been abusive as well. And then the other thing we did for a long time was bhajans, which is something that comes from Hinduism. That was one of the other ministers. It was part of her spiritual background, where we would get together and we would all sit in a room and sing. And so that was, kind of just introducing you guys to some of the practices that happened last episode. And the reason that I wanted to do that is because for me to really explain the type of things that happened in my childhood and the dictation that began happening as I grew up, and how people fall into this, but as well as how they are stuck in it and begin to not question things that normally, as a free thinking human, you would start questioning. This is how this kind of stuff happens because of, the little things that began happening. So, and just when my family joined, I was 8 years old. So, as far as we've gone through the last few episodes, I'm still a young child. And I want to kind of talk about after we got there and we had moved here and we were living in a house, how things began getting dictated from the spirit that Trina tranced or through processes that were happening with my parents. So that's what we're going to dive into today. And it will begin to start to paint the picture because these were the teachings of the church that we were in. So when you're a part of those kind of communities, there's this rational person that does question it, but then they're overridden by the way that you are broken down. And this is a very long and a very slow process. This doesn't happen overnight. But as it begins to happen, you slowly make allowances for these little things that as they're told to you, you're like, okay, well, I trust this person. I trust this spiritual advice. I trust, that they have my best interest at heart. So I will allow this. And then next thing you know, these asks become bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the gaslighting gets more and more and more until you are not the same person anymore. And you pretty much will let most things ride and you'll go with most things because you think that that's what you need to do. And now you're trying to maintain relationships with people that you care about, that you consider family, if not really close friends, people that you've known for a decade or decades or that you've grown up with. So it is just little steps over time that begin to drive you into these things. So, for example, I'd already kind of shared in one of the other episodes, we're now living in houses with other families. So even though it may be my parents' home, we're living with other families. One of the houses we lived in for a long time, which my parents owned, was on 7th Street in Mesa. And it was surrounded by 3 other houses, at least, directly like next door to, of other members who owned those homes. So everybody freely visited each other. You know, it was very normal that you'd have two or three families living in a house. Somebody would walk in your front door and it would just be your neighbor. And it was like we were all family. It would be like somebody walking in your front door, just like your close family members. That was the vibe of the way things were. In that, we were given regular direction either from Duran, the spirit that Trina channeled, or we were given regular direction through processes that my family or that my parents would go to about what was going on with them, their relationship, their kids, all of that kind of stuff. And everybody had a pulse on what was going on with everybody. So it was specifically against the teaching to have secrets about anything. And so it was this environment that got created where everybody would kind of tell what other people were doing. And because you lived with different families in your household, there was nothing that really got away from people consistently bringing to these either trances or these processes what was going on. So if you and your significant other or get into an argument, then if you didn't share that, then the other people that lived with you might. Or if one of the children was going through something or acting up or being disrespectful or any of those kind of things, then those things would be brought to those circles as well. And so it was always this asking of guidance, but also asking, also talking to each other about the things that were up. And living with people is difficult regardless. There's a lot of things you have to be working through. So the idea was that you were going to these processes to work through these events and circumstances and stuff of living with other people. But there was other tactics that I look back now that I would specifically call tactics that were very difficult to deal with, that made things much worse. One of them was that, like I've shared, we were all supposed to be considered family. So we lived communally in different homes, but every family that lived within a house, it was like there was 2 bedrooms for boys, 1 bedroom for boys, 1 bedroom for girls in a lot of the houses, depending on how many kids were in the house, right? And then each adult couple had a bedroom. So if you have a 5-bedroom house, there could be 3 couples and then 2 bedrooms for each set of kids, boys and girls, which meant that you had this huge variety of ages going through and living in a house together. And it would happen regularly that either during a process or during a trance circle that they would move families around. So we moved to Arizona. We move into a house with a few other families. Very shortly, we moved to another house, which I think is the house that my parents eventually bought. And then we're living with another family there. And then all of a sudden we get notification, and I was a kid, so I don't know exactly how it happened, but all of a sudden we're now moving to another house. So we moved to this house, which at the time they called the farm, which was farther away. And we're living out at this house, and now we're in this room that was a garage that had been made into a bedroom. And I think there was like 5 girls living in the room. I think the only boy in the house was my little brother. So he could have been in a fucking alcove in, the living room, to be honest. And I think there was at least 3 couples living out there at that house, because for whatever reason, and I don't know what happened, like I was still a kid, so I was not in the processes yet, but for whatever reason, they decided we all needed to live together. The house that my parents owned actually went empty for a very long time and nobody was living in it. So there was a purpose between all of us living together out there. I could not tell you to this day what the purpose was, other than just mass fucking chaos. And then, jump forward a year or so later, we all moved back into the house that my parents own. So, and this was I can't tell you the time period. I just know roughly ages and where I had birthdays, kind of. But it was just, there was always this massive amount of people and children. And then there was this chaos of always moving. So you were promoted to not be too attached to your belongings. And everything was done together. You know, prior to us moving to the church, prior to us moving to the cult, we had regular family things. We would do things as a family. And as soon as we moved, we never did anything as a family. Dinner was a group gathering with all these other families. You know, it was considered in your blood to take your kids somewhere and not take whatever kids were there. So you either had to take the entire age group. So we never went to fireworks. Like, that was just something we never went to. I remember the last time we went to fireworks was when we lived in Maryland. We never went to fireworks again as a child until I had my own kids years later. So, I mean, for years, we never did any of that. I think we stopped going on family vacations. Most vacations were not a thing we did. And a lot of those things, the exception to that was Trina and Stephen, the leaders of the church. They would do a lot of that. You know, they would do specific things sometimes with their kids, or their kids, and each kid could bring a friend or something. But Trina and Stephen would go on vacation. Trina and Stephen would have, like, their stuff still was very large and extravagant. So birthday parties became much more minimal for me. And Christmases were always a big thing because Trina and Stephen made Christmas a big thing. But their children always got twice as much as everybody else. They had these massive, extravagant Christmases. So they would get to the point that their kids hadn't even opened all their gifts on Christmas. And meanwhile, nobody else was like that. So it's like we're sharing money and there's not enough money for everybody, but there's always enough money for Trina and Stephen and their children. And these are things that you had to shut the fuck up about and never really bring up, because this expectation was that Trina and Stephen's kids were more spiritual than you because they had grown up in the teaching and they had grown up with Duran and they had earned these things. So they earned all of this. We had to work to earn those types of things. And if you fucked up in any way, then, you know, you could lose it at any time. So it's better to just not be attached to things. Meanwhile, everybody's jerked around all the time by being moved from house to house on a regular basis. I can't tell you, once we moved back into the house that my parents owned by then, I don't remember moving a lot after that. But there's small times. We'll get to those. We're not there yet. I'm still just a wee bairn. So a lot of things started changing right around the age of between 10 and 12 years old. So like I said, I got there when I was 8. We've barely just hitting like the 10 to 12 year range. By the age of 12, that was considered the age of responsibility, meaning you were basically considered an adult by the time you were the age of 12. So you were not allowed to, you were expected to go to trances. You were allowed to be in processes. So prior to that age, were not necessarily supposed to be, but also you were expected to clean and to babysit and for whoever you were supposed to, usually one of the ministers. So I remember prior to that, at one point, there had been a process or a transfer. Duran had said that me and my sister needed to begin serving more. And so we had to start making breakfast every day. And to me at the time, like it's not even really that negative of a memory for me, because I just remember that I got to get up every day and make breakfast with my sister. But it was, you have to make breakfast every day for everybody in the house. So we would get up every day and we would make a whole breakfast for everybody that we lived with, which at the time was not just our family. It was whatever other families lived with us. And there was at least two families in the house. So we would cook for them. Around the time as well, my mom started cooking dinners for the entire collective of the church. I don't remember exactly what age that started. I do remember it would just be massive dinners, enough to feed, like, 80 people, 100 people, because there were some people that didn't live directly right around there, so obviously those people were not a part of that. But everybody who lived directly around there and who was financially tied in would come and eat dinner. So my mother, I mean, it was cooking for massive amounts of people. It was her making these huge bowls of salad and spaghetti and beans and Mexican food. And it was always the kind of food that you could make inexpensively, right? Like, we weren't eating, a lot of times it was rice dishes or bean dishes or pasta dishes, or, things that could be economically made for a large amount of people. Like, so my mom, one of her biggest responsibilities was always cooking for massive amounts of people. And as a kid, that would be something that I would have to, help with over the years. I mean, when I got home, if I got home from school and she was starting to make dinner, I would sit and, cut up lettuce for salads, or wash lettuce, or grate cheese, or, cut up olives, or whatever it was, right? So, slowly we're just getting integrated and ingrained and slowly going with the flow of the things that were expected. And in that, there's a process, or there's a trance, and it's, Duran says this, or one of the ministers say this, and you do what they say to do. So, me and Megan start making breakfast every day for a long, and I don't remember how long that lasted, but it was a while. At some point, it was the moving stuff, where you were moved in and out of different households. It was the expectation that everybody had to be part of something bigger. So because it was a huge undertaking to take a large amount of people to anything, then it just didn't happen very often. So if it wasn't something that was the school was ingrained in doing, or the school was doing that we went to, which was, again, the church school, then it often didn't happen. And I don't know, at some point around there, it just became clear that was just our new life. Our new life was doing what we're told for the purpose of this church and the purpose of this community, and that it was bigger than just me, and it was bigger than just my siblings, and it was bigger than my family. It was like there was this big purpose behind everything we did. And we even did community events. Like, there was a massive bazaar that they put on around that time too. And I probably was like 11 years old. So we're talking back in, late 80s, early 90s. They did this massive bazaar, and think of it as like this extravagant garage sale where they got donations from paint companies and clothing companies. And, I mean, this thing filled up half of Mesa Community College's parking lot. And they raised, I believe it was somewhere around $10,000 for, it's like Phoenix Children's Hospital or something like that. That was something that they put on. So they would do all this kind of huge things as a church. And it was donated by, I believe, my mom's midwifery business at the time. I think that's the name they actually put it under instead of the church. But it was these huge things that as a church we would do. So it seemed like in a lot of ways we were doing a lot of good. The control on the back end and the way that our family began to get broken down, that was the part that became toxic. So it became toxic because it started tearing apart me and my siblings. It started depleting the relationship and the respect for my parents. So, I mean, there was still a lot of times where where I really looked up to my older sister. But then as we began getting told that, blood is not important and not to just take our siblings' side for things, we're consistently being inundated with having to accept all these other things that are happening in these inequalities around us because of spiritual measures, right? So Trina and Steven and their children are all held at these different higher spiritual levels. And it's like, well, no, they know more than you because they were raised in this and they've been with the spirit since day one. And, and this is what Trina has done her entire life. And it's interesting because I listened to a trance recently that was still it was, from well over a decade ago, right? Maybe 12 or 15 years ago. But I'm listening to this trance and I must have been, in my like 31, somewhere around that age. And I'm listening to this and the spirit that she channeled is talking to everybody. And he's still saying the same shit. Like, their children were raised in this. My entire fucking family was raised in it. I've been there since I was fucking 8 years old. But there's still this tier level that's consistently being shit on everybody below. And I'm like listening to this and I was like, oh my gosh, that was such a fucking gaslighting. It was such a thing that was used against me and my siblings. Even my baby sister was born there. My little brother had been there since he was a toddler. Like that was all he remembers. He doesn't remember life before that. Me and my sister do, but there was only a small gap before we were still kids when we got there. But that was still being gaslit against us. And this is the kind of shit the cults do. Like, they create this narrative and you've heard it for so long, you just don't realize that it's bullshit anymore. Because the little yeses that you've given along the way have gaslit you into thinking that there's a truth to it, right? So you don't even think that you need to question it anymore. So because you've just gone along with it for so long. So you're like, oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. We should definitely move houses again because we're getting too comfortable here. So it would really be great for our family to go move in with another 2 families over there. That seems like a great idea. Yeah, we shouldn't be all about just our kids. We got to pull in everybody's children. And as a person, I will always love other people's kids. But I have a responsibility to my children that I will always uphold. So don't mishear me when I'm saying, like, you can love other people's children, and that doesn't mean that you're selling yours down the road. Okay? Which I feel like the way and the nuance that we were gaslit with, it was so that there was a level of manipulation that went along with it, and expectation on the way that we could be controlled. 100%. So anyway, on next episode, we are going to talk about another sibling. So we're going to get into that. We're also going to talk about the smoking and drinking. Because somewhere around the age of 12 is when I began smoking and when I began drinking, and also when I got a new sibling. So we're going to dive into those next episodes, so make sure you're here for that. I want to talk a little bit about, I think it's important that although my cult had its own nuances in the tactics, not the tactics, but the expectations and the patterns that they did, those were specific to our church. The way that churches do this and the way that cults specifically manipulate is pretty standard across the board. And it goes on so long that you begin to think that you are the problem. So I really want this to be a place that also creates a level of healing for you if you have been in a dysfunctional, abusive, religious environment. And make no mistake, this is a abusive religious environment. An abusive religious environment means that somebody of power took advantage of that power because of spiritual beliefs and used it against you for some type of gain. Financial, power dynamic, you having to sell your soul and, serve them on hand and foot type of stuff. And that is not an over-exaggeration a lot of the time. So if you've been through something like that, I want you to understand, you have to begin to find ways to get your power back, right? Because there's some place that you relinquish control of who you are, and you need to be able to begin to build that back up from your heart and align your head with your heart. So there's something called brain and heart coherence, okay? And brain and heart coherence really means, and there's a bunch of stuff on this, you guys can look this up, but brain and heart coherence means that your thoughts and your feelings begin to align with each other. And you can only do that when you're not in a completely stressed state. And trying to do that actually helps to get you into a centered and calmer state. So when you're in your head, so here's just a quick practice. When you're in your head, putting your hand on your heart helps to get you there. So what you do is you just stick your hand on your heart. You can stick both your hands right there if you'd like to. And then just think about whatever the situation that's coming your way. Just think about as you're mulling over the situation, how it would feel in your heart. And that's it. That's the practice for today. Just practice doing that every day for a minute or two. And you can do it multiple times a day if it works for you. But just start thinking about your heart and your brain coming together and aligning and being coherent with each other. And these are going to begin to start to flush out the things that aren't working for you anymore. Because you have to begin changing your thinking from the person that was in that situation. And that person may have helped you survive. Like who you had to become when you went through that situation may have helped you to survive up until this point. But now that person is going to prevent you from getting to the next thing that you need to get to, or from becoming the human that you want to be. So do not let the pain of past experiences prevent you from being in the beauty of the person that you can be, because you deserve that. You deserve to shine your light and to be wonderful and amazing and to, have powerful, beautiful relationships, have a wonderful, beautiful family, have wonderful relationships with your children and with the people that you care about and with, those you value. You have every right to work and love what you do on a regular basis and to be healthy and to be happy. That is your right. And you absolutely should have all those things if they mean that to you and more, whatever lights you up inside. So I want you to be inspired that if I was able to do it, that I can teach you how to do it. And I'm going to give you tips throughout this. You can always check out my other stuff if you want to. I don't care if you do. This podcast is enough for you. It's enough for you. So hope you guys have an amazing time. I thank you so much again for being here with me and listening to me. You are always welcome to reach out to me with questions or on social media, and have an amazing day. Thank you. Bye-bye.